The Sleuths, by O. Henry. In the big city, a man will disappear with the suddenness and completeness of the flame of a candle that is blown out. All the agencies of inquisition, the hounds of the trail, the sleuths of the city's labyrinths, the closet detectives of theory and induction, will be invoked to the search. Most often the man's face will be seen no more. Sometimes he will reappear in Sheboygan or in the wilds of Terre Haute, calling himself one of the synonyms of Smith, and without memory of events up to a certain time, including his grocer's bill. Sometimes it will be found, after dragging the rivers, and polling the restaurants to see if he may be waiting for a well-done sirloin, that he has moved next door. This snuffing out of a human being like the erasure of a chalk man from a blackboard is one of the most impressive themes in dramaturgy. The case of Mary Snyder, in point, should not be without interest. A man of middle age, of the name of Meeks, came from the West to New York to find his sister, Mrs. Mary Snyder, a widow, aged 52, who had been living for a year in a tenement house in a crowded neighborhood. At her address, he was told that Mary Snyder had moved away longer than a month before. No one could tell him her new address. On coming out, Mr. Meeks addressed a policeman who was standing on the corner and explained his dilemma. "My sister is very poor," he said, "and I am anxious to find her. I have recently made quite a lot of money in a lead mine, and I want her to share my prosperity. There is no use in advertising her, because she cannot read." The policeman pulled his mustache and looked so thoughtful and mighty that Meeks could almost feel the joyful tears of his sister Mary dropping upon his bright blue tie. "You go down in the Canal Street neighborhood," said the policeman, "and get a job driving the biggest dray you can find. There's old women always getting knocked over by drays down there. You might see her among 'em. If you don't want to do that, you better go round to headquarters and get 'em to put a fly cop onto the dame." At police headquarters, Meeks received ready assistance. A general alarm was sent out, and copies of a photograph of Mary Snyder that her brother had were distributed among the stations. In Mulberry Street, the chief assigned Detective Mullins to the case. The detective took Meeks aside and said, "This is not a very difficult case to unravel. Shave off your whiskers, fill your pockets with good cigars, and meet me in the Café of the Waldorf at 3 o'clock this afternoon." Meeks obeyed. He found Mullins there. They had a bottle of wine, while the detective asked questions concerning the missing woman. "Now," said Mullins, "New York is a big city, but we've got the detective business systematized. There are two ways we can go about finding your sister. We will try one of them first. You say she's 52? "A little past," said Meeks. The detective conducted the Westerner to a branch advertising office of one of the largest dailies. There he wrote the following ad and submitted it to Meeks. "Wanted, at once, 100 attractive chorus girls for a new musical comedy. Apply all day at No. Broadway." Meeks was indignant. "My sister," said he, "is a poor, hard-working, elderly woman. I do not see what aid an advertisement of this kind would be toward finding her." "All right," said the detective. "I guess you don't know New York. But if you've got a grouch against this scheme, we'll try the other one. It's a sure thing, but it'll cost you more." "Never mind the expense," said Meeks. "We'll try it." The sleuth led him back to the Waldorf. "Engage a couple of bedrooms and a parlor," he advised, "and let's go up." This was done, and the two were shown to a superb suite on the 4th floor. Meeks looked puzzled. The detective sank into a velvet armchair and pulled out his cigar case. "I forgot to suggest, old man," he said, "that you should have taken the rooms by the month. They wouldn't have stuck you so much for him." "By the month?" exclaimed Meeks. "What do you mean?" "Oh, it'll take time to work the game this way. I told you it would cost you more. We'll have to wait till spring. There'll be a new city directory out then. Very likely your sister's name and address will be in it." Meeks rid himself of the city detective at once. On the next day, someone advised him to consult Shamrock Jones, New York's famous private detective, who demanded fabulous fees, but performed miracles in the way of solving mysteries and crimes. After waiting for 2 hours in the anteroom of the great detective's apartment, Meeks was shown into his presence. Jones sat in a purple dressing gown at an inlaid ivory chess table, with a magazine before him, trying to solve the mystery of the famous sleuth's thin, intellectual face, piercing eyes, and rate per word are too well known to need description. Meeks set forth his errand. My fee, if successful, will be $500, said Shamrock Jones. Meeks bowed his agreement to the price. I will undertake your case, Mr. Meeks, said Jones finally. The disappearance of people in this city has always been an interesting problem to me. I remember a case that I brought to a successful outcome a year ago. A family bearing the name of Clark disappeared suddenly from a small flat in which they were living. I watched the flat building for 2 months for a clue. One day it struck me that a certain milkman and a grocer's boy always walked backward when they carried their wares upstairs. Following out by induction the idea that this observation gave me, I at once located the missing family. They had moved into the flat across the hall and changed their name to Krauk. Shamrock Jones and his client went to the tenement house where Mary Snyder had lived, and the detective demanded to be shown the room in which she had lived. It had been occupied by no tenant since her disappearance. The room was small, dingy, and poorly furnished. Meeks seated himself dejectedly on a broken chair, while the great detective searched the walls and floor and the few sticks of old, rickety furniture for a clue. At the end of half an hour, Jones had collected a few seemingly unintelligible articles, a cheap black hat pin, a piece torn off a theater program, and the end of a small torn card on which was the word left and the characters C12. Shamrock Jones leaned against the mantel for 10 minutes, with his head resting upon his hand, and an absorbed look upon his intellectual face. At the end of that time he exclaimed, with animation, "Come, Mr. Meeks, the problem is solved. I can take you directly to the house where your sister is living, and you may have no fears concerning her welfare, for she is amply provided with funds, for the present at least." Meeks felt joy and wonder in equal proportions. "How did you manage it?" he asked, with admiration in his tones. Perhaps Jones's only weakness was a professional pride in his wonderful achievements in induction. He was ever ready to astound and charm his listeners by describing his methods. "By elimination," said Jones, spreading his clues upon a little table, "I got rid of certain parts of the city to which Mrs. Snyder might have removed. You see this hatpin? That eliminates Brooklyn. No woman attempts to board a car at the Brooklyn Bridge without being sure that she carries a hatpin with which to fight her way into a seat. And now I will demonstrate to you that she could not have gone to Harlem. Behind this door are 2 hooks in the wall. Upon one of these Mrs. Snyder has hung her bonnet, and upon the other her shawl. You will observe that the bottom of the hanging shawl has gradually made a soiled streak against the plastered wall. The mark is clean-cut, proving that there is no fringe on the shawl. Now, was there ever a case where a middle-aged woman, wearing a shawl, boarded a Harlem train without there being a fringe on the shawl to catch in the gate and delay the passengers behind her? So we eliminate Harlem. Therefore I conclude that Mrs. Snyder has not moved very far away. On this torn piece of card you see the word left, the letter C, and the number 12. Now, I happen to know that number 12 Avenue C is a first-class boarding house, far beyond your sister's means, as we suppose. But then I find this piece of a theater program, crumpled into an odd shape. What meaning does it convey? None to you, very likely, Mr. Meeks, but it is eloquent to one whose habits and training take cognizance of the small s things. You have told me that your sister was a scrub woman. She scrubbed the floors of offices and hallways. Let us assume that she procured such work to perform in a theater. Where is valuable jewelry lost the oftenest, Mr. Meeks? In the theaters, of course. Look at that piece of program, Mr. Meeks. Observe the round impression in it. It has been wrapped around a ring, perhaps a ring of great value. Mrs. Snyder found the ring while at work in the theater. She hastily tore off a piece of a program, wrapped the ring carefully, and thrust it into her bosom. The next day she disposed of it, and, with her increased means, looked about her for a more comfortable place in which to live. When I reach thus far in the chain I see nothing impossible about number 12 Avenue C. It is there we will find your sister, Mr. Meeks." Shamrock Jones concluded his convincing speech with the smile of a successful artist. Meeks's admiration was too great for words. Together they went to number 12 Avenue C. It was an old-fashioned brownstone house in a prosperous and respectable neighborhood. They rang the bell, and on inquiring were told that no Mrs. Snyder was known there. and that not within 6 months had a new occupant come to the house. When they reached the sidewalk again, Meeks examined the clues which he had brought away from his sister's old room. "I am no detective," he remarked to Jones as he raised the piece of theater program to his nose. "But it seems to me that instead of a ring having been wrapped in this paper, it was one of those round peppermint drops. And this piece with the address on it looks to me like the end of a seat coupon. Number 12, row C, left aisle." Shamrock Jones had a faraway look in his eyes. "I think you would do well to consult Juggins," said he. "Who is Juggins?" asked Meeks. "He is the leader," said Jones, "of a new modern school of detectives. Their methods are different from ours, but it is said that Juggins has solved some extremely puzzling cases. I will take you to him." They found the greater Juggins in his office. He was a small man with light hair, deeply absorbed in reading one of the bourgeois works of Nathaniel Hawthorne. The two great detectives of different schools shook hands with ceremony, and Meeks was introduced. "State the facts," said Juggins, going on with his reading. When Meeks ceased, the greater one closed his book and said, "Do I understand that your sister is 52 years of age, with a large mole on the side of her nose, and that she is a very poor widow, making a scanty living by scrubbing, and with a very homely face and figure?" "That describes her exactly," admitted Meeks. Juggins rose and put on his hat. "In 15 minutes, he said, I will return, bringing you her present address." Shamrock Jones turned pale, but forced a smile. Within the specified time, Juggins returned and consulted a little slip of paper held in his hand. "Your sister, Mary Snyder," he announced calmly, "will be found at number 162 Chilton Street. She is living in the back hall bedroom, 5 flights up. The house is only 4 blocks from here," he continued, addressing Meeks. "Suppose you go and verify the statement and then return here. Mr. Jones will await you, I dare say." Meeks hurried away. In 20 minutes he was back again, with a beaming face. "She is there and well," he cried. "Name your fee." $2, said Juggins. When Meeks had settled his bill and departed, Shamrock Jones stood with his hat in his hand before Juggins. "If it would not be asking too much," he stammered, "if you would favor me so far, would you object to—" "Certainly not," said Juggins pleasantly. "I will tell you how I did it. You remember the description of Mrs. Snyder? Did you ever know a woman like that who wasn't paying weekly installments on an enlarged crayon portrait of herself? The biggest factory of that kind in the country is just around the corner. I went there and got her address off the books. That's all." The Skylight Room, by O. Henry. First, Mrs. Parker would show you the double parlors. You would not dare to interrupt her description of their advantages and of the merits of the gentleman who had occupied them for 8 years. Then you would manage to stammer forth the confession that you were neither a doctor nor a dentist. Mrs. Parker's manner of receiving the admission was such that you could never afterward entertain the same feeling toward your parents, who had neglected to train you up in one of the professions that fitted Mrs. Parker's parlors. Next you ascended 1 flight of stairs and looked at the second, floor back at $8. Convinced by her second-floor manner that it was worth the $12 that Mr. Tussenberry always paid for it until he left to take charge of his brother's orange plantation in Florida near Palm Beach, where Mrs. McIntyre always spent the winters that had the double front room with private bath, you managed to babble that you wanted something still cheaper. If you survived Mrs. Parker's scorn, you were taken to look at Mr. Skidder's large hall room on the 3rd floor. Mr. Skidder's room was not vacant. He wrote plays and smoked cigarettes in it all day long. But every room hunter was made to visit his room to admire the lambrequins. After each visit, Mr. Skidder, from the fright caused by possible eviction, would pay something on his rent. Then, if you still stood on 1 foot, with your hot hand clutching the 3 moist dollars in your pocket, and hoarsely proclaimed your hideous and culpable poverty, nevermore would Mrs. Parker be cicerone of yours. She would honk loudly the word Clara. She would show you her back and march downstairs. Then Clara, the colored maid, would escort you up the carpeted ladder that served for the 4th flight and show you the Skylight Room. It occupied 7 by 8 feet of floor space at the middle of the hall. On each side of it was a dark lumber closet or storeroom. In it was an iron cot, a washstand, and a chair. A shelf was the dresser. Its four bare walls seemed to close in upon you like the sides of a coffin. Your hand crept to your throat. You gasped. You looked up as from a well and breathed once more. Through the glass of the little skylight you saw a square of blue infinity. $2, Sue, Clara would say in her half-contemptuous, half-Tuscagenial tones. One day Miss Leeson came hunting for a room. She carried a typewriter made to be lugged around by a much larger lady. She was a very little girl, with eyes and hair that had kept on growing after she had stopped, and that always looked as if they were saying, "Goodness me, why didn't you keep up with us?" Mrs. Parker showed her the double parlors. "In this closet," she said, "one could keep a skeleton or anesthetic or coal." "But I am neither a doctor nor a dentist," said Miss Leeson, with a shiver. Mrs. Parker gave her the incredulous, pitying, sneering, icy stare that she kept for those who failed to qualify as doctors or dentists, and led the way to the second floor back. $8, said Miss Leeson. "Dear me, I'm not heady if I do look green. I'm just a poor little working girl. Show me something higher and lower." Mr. Skidder jumped and strewed the floor with cigarette stubs at the rap on his door. "Excuse me, Mr. Skidder," said Mrs. Parker, with her demon smile at his pale looks. "I didn't know you were in. I asked the lady to have a look at your lambrequins." "They're too lovely for anything," said Miss Leeson, smiling in exactly the way the angels do. After they had gone, Mr. Skidder got very busy erasing the tall, black-haired heroine from his latest, unproduced, play and inserting a small, roguish one with heavy, bright hair and vivacious features. "Anna Held'll jump at it," said Mr. Skidder to himself, putting his feet up against the lambrequins and disappearing in a cloud of smoke like an aerial cuttlefish. Presently the tocsin call of "Clara" sounded to the world the state of Miss Leeson's purse. A dark goblin seized her, mounted a Stygian stairway, thrust her into a vault with a glimmer of light in its top, and muttered the menacing and cabalistic words, $2. "I'll take it," sighed Miss Leeson, sinking down upon the squeaky iron bed. Every day Miss Leeson went out to work. At night she brought home papers with handwriting on them and made copies with her typewriter. Sometimes she had no work at night, and then she would sit on the steps of the high stoop with the other roomers. Miss Leeson was not intended for a Skylight Room when the plans were drawn for her creation. She was gay-hearted and full of tender, whimsical fancies. Once she let Mr. Skidder read to her 3 acts of his great, unpublished comedy, It's No Kid, or The Heir of the Subway. There was rejoicing among the gentlemen roomers whenever Miss Leeson had time to sit on the steps for an hour or two. But Miss Longnecker, the tall blonde who taught in a public school and said, "Well, really," to everything you said, sat on the top step and sniffed. And Miss Dorn, who shot at the moving ducks at Coney every Sunday and worked in a department store, sat on the bottom step and sniffed. Miss Leeson sat on the middle step, and the men would quickly group around her. Especially Mr. Skidder, who had cast her in his mind for the star part in a private, romantic, unspoken drama in real life. And especially Mr. Hoover, who was 45, fat, flush, and foolish. And especially very young Mr. Evans, who set up a hollow cough to induce her to ask him to leave off cigarettes. The men voted her the funniest and jolliest ever, but the sniffs on the top step and the lower step were implacable. I pray you let the drama halt while chorus stalks to the footlights and drops an epicedian tear upon the fatness of Mr. Hoover. Tune the pipes to the tragedy of tallow, the bane of bulk, the calamity of corpulence. Tried out, Falstaff might have rendered more romance to the ton than would have Romeo's rickety ribs to the ounce. A lover may sigh, but he must not puff. To the train of Momus are the fat men remanded. In vain beats the faithfulest heart above a 52-inch belt. Avaunt, Hoover. Hoover, 45, flush and foolish, might carry off Helen herself. Hoover, 45, flush, foolish and fat is meat for perdition. There was never a chance for you, Hoover. As Mrs. Parker's roomers sat thus one summer's evening, Miss Leeson looked up into the firmament and cried with her little gay laugh. "Why, there's Billy Jackson. I can see him from down here, too." All looked up, some at the windows of skyscrapers, some casting about for an airship. Jackson guided. "It's that star," explained Miss Leeson, pointing with a tiny finger. Not the big one that twinkles, the steady blue one near it. I can see it every night through my skylight. I named it Billy Jackson. Well, really, said Miss Longnecker. I didn't know you were an astronomer, Miss Leeson. Oh, yes, said the small stargazer. I know as much as any of them about the style of sleeves they're going to wear next fall in Mars. Well, really, said Miss Longnecker. The star you refer to is Gamma, of the constellation Cassiopeia. It is nearly of the second magnitude, and its meridian passage is— Oh, said the very young Mr. Evans. I think Billy Jackson is a much better name for it. Same here, said Mr. Hoover, loudly breathing defiance to Miss Longnecker. I think Miss Leeson has just as much right to name stars as any of those old astrologers had. Well, really, said Miss Longnecker. I wonder whether it's a shooting star, remarked Miss Dorn. I hit 9 ducks and a rabbit out of 10 in the gallery at Coney Sunday. He doesn't show up very well from down here, said Miss Leeson. You ought to see him from my room. You know you can see stars even in the daytime from the bottom of a well. At night my room is like the shaft of a coal mine, and it makes Billy Jackson look like the big diamond pin that Night fastens her kimono with. There came a time after that when Miss Leeson brought no formidable papers home to copy, and when she went out in the morning, instead of working, she went from office to office and let her heart melt away in the drip of cold refusals transmitted through insolent office boys. This went on. There came an evening when she wearily climbed Mrs. Parker's stoop at the hour when she always returned from her dinner at the restaurant. But she had had no dinner. As she stepped into the hall, Mr. Hoover met her and seized his chance. He asked her to marry him, and his fatness hovered above her like an avalanche. She dodged and caught the balustrade. He tried for her hand, and she raised it and smote him weakly in the face. Step by step she went up, dragging herself by the railing. She passed Mr. Skidder's door as he was red-inking a stage direction for Myrtle Delorme, Miss Leeson, in his unaccepted comedy, to pirouette across stage from L to the side of the Count. Up the carpeted ladder she crawled at last and opened the door of the Skylight Room. She was too weak to light the lamp or to undress. She fell upon the iron cot, her fragile body scarcely hollowing the worn springs. And in that Erebus of the Skylight Room, she slowly raised her heavy eyelids and smiled. For Billy Jackson was shining down on her, calm and bright and constant through the skylight. There was no world about her. She was sunk in a pit of blackness, with but that small square of pallid light framing the star that she had so whimsically and so ineffectually named. Miss Longnecker must be right. It was Gamma, of the constellation Cassiopeia, and not Billy Jackson. And yet she could not let it be Gamma. As she lay on her back, she tried twice to raise her arm. The third time, she got 2 thin fingers to her lips and blew a kiss out of the black pit to Billy Jackson. Her arm fell back limply. "Goodbye, Billy," she murmured faintly. "You're millions of miles away, and you won't even twinkle once. But you kept where I could see you most of the time up there when there wasn't anything else but darkness to look at, didn't you? Millions of miles. Goodbye, Billy Jackson." Clara, the colored maid, found the door locked at 10 the next day, and they forced it open. Vinegar and the slapping of wrists and burnt feathers proving of no avail, someone ran to phone for an ambulance. In due time it backed up to the door with much gong clanging, and the capable young medico, in his white linen coat, ready, active, confident, with his smooth face half debonair, half grim, danced up the steps. "Ambulance call to 49, he said briefly. "What's the trouble?" "Oh, yes, doctor," sniffed Mrs. Parker, as though her trouble that there should be trouble in the house was the greater. "I can't think what can be the matter with her. Nothing we could do would bring her to. It's a young woman, a Miss Elsie, yes, a Miss Elsie Leeson. Never before in my house." "What room?" cried the doctor in a terrible voice, to which Mrs. Parker was a stranger. "The Skylight Room." Evidently the ambulance doctor was familiar with the location of Skylight Rooms. He was gone up the stairs, for at a time. Mrs. Parker followed slowly, as her dignity demanded. On the first landing, she met him coming back bearing the astronomer in his arms. He stopped and let loose the practiced scalpel of his tongue, not loudly. Gradually, Mrs. Parker crumpled as a stiff garment that slips down from a nail. Ever afterward there remained crumples in her mind and body. Sometimes her curious rumors would ask her what the doctor said to her. "Let that be," she would answer. "If I can get forgiveness for having heard it, I will be satisfied." The ambulance physician strode with his burden through the pack of hounds that follow the curiosity chase, and even they fell back along the sidewalk abashed, for his face was that of one who bears his own dead. They noticed that he did not lay down upon the bed prepared for it in the ambulance the form that he carried, and all that he said was, "Drive like H.L. Wilson," to the driver. That is all. Is it a story? In the next morning's paper I saw a little news item, and the last sentence of it may help you, as it helped me, to weld the incidents together. It recounted the reception into Bellevue Hospital of a young woman who had been removed from number 49 East Street, suffering from debility induced by starvation. It concluded with these words: "Dr. William Jackson, the ambulance physician who attended the case, says the patient will recover." The Shocks of Doom, by O. Henry. Here is an aristocracy of the public parks and even of the vagabonds who use them for their private apartments. Valence felt rather than knew this, but when he stepped down out of his world into chaos, his feet brought him directly to Madison Square. Raw and astringent as a schoolgirl, of the old order, young May breathed austerely among the budding trees. Valence buttoned his coat, lighted his last cigarette, and took his seat upon a bench. For 3 minutes he mildly regretted the last 100 of his last 1,000 that it had cost him when the bicycle cop put an end to his last automobile ride. Then he felt in every pocket and found not a single penny. He had given up his apartment that morning. His furniture had gone toward certain debts. His clothes, save what were upon him, had descended to his manservant for back wages. As he sat there was not in the whole city for him a bed, or a broiled lobster, or a streetcar fare, or a carnation for buttonhole, unless he should obtain them by spong, on his friends, or by false pretenses. Therefore I had chosen the park. And all this was because an uncle had disinherited him, and cut down his allowance from liberality to nothing. And all that was because his nephew had disobeyed him concerning a certain girl, who comes not into this story. Therefore, all readers who brush their hair toward its roots may be warned to read no further. There was another nephew, of a different branch, who had once been the prospective heir and favorite. Being without grace or hope, he had long ago disappeared in the mire. Now nets were out for him. He was to be rehabilitated and restored. And so Valence fell grandly as Lucifer to the lowest pit, joining the tattered ghosts in the little park. Sitting there, he leaned far back on the hard bench and laughed a jet of cigarette smoke up to the lowest tree branches. The sudden severing of all his life's ties had brought him a free, thrilling, almost joyous elation. He felt precisely the sensation of the arrow, not when he cuts loose his parachute and lets his balloon drift away. The hour was nearly 10. Not many loungers were on the benches. The park dweller, though a stubborn fighter against autumnal coolness, is slow to attack the advance line of spring's chilly cohorts. Then arose one from a seat near the leaping fawn, Tane, and came and sat himself at Valence's side. He was either young or old. Cheap lodging houses had flavored him mustily. Razors and combs had passed him by. In him drink had been bottled and sealed in the devil's bond. He begged a match, which is the form of introduction among park benchers, and then he began to talk. "You're not one of the regulars," he said to Val Lance. "I know tailored clothes when I see him. You just stopped for a moment on your way through the park. Don't mind my talking to you for a while? I've got to be with somebody. I'm afraid. I've told 2 or 3 of those bummers over about it. They think I'm crazy. Say, let tell you. All I've had to eat today was a couple pretzels and an apple. Tomorrow I'll stand in to inherit 3 millions. And that restaurant you eat over there with the autos around it will be 2 for me to eat in. Don't believe it, do you?" "Without the slightest trouble," said Valence with a laugh. "I lunched there yesterday. Tonight I couldn't buy a 5-cent cup of coffee. You don't look like one of us." "Well, I guess those things happen. I used to be a high flyer myself years ago. What knocked you out of the game?" I lost my job," said Valence. "It's undiluted Hades, this city," went on the other. One day you're eating from China. The next you are eating in China, a chop suey joint. I've had more than my share of hard luck. For 5 years, I've been little better than a panhandler. I was raised up to live expensively and do nothing. Say, I don't mind telling you. I've got to talk to somebody, you see, because I'm afraid. I'm afraid. My name's Ide. You wouldn't think that old Paulding, one of the millionaires on Riverside Drive, was my uncle, would you? Well, he is. I lived in his house once and had all the money I wanted. Say, haven't you got the price of a couple of drinks about you? What's your name? Dawson, said Valance. No, I'm sorry to say that I'm all in, financially. I've been living for a week in a coal cellar on Division Street, went on Ide, with a crook they called Blinky Morris. I didn't have anywhere else to go. While I was out today, a chap with some purse in his pocket was there, asking for me. I didn't know but what he was a fly cop, so I didn't go around again till after dark. There was a letter their B had left for me. Say, Dawson, it was from a big downtown lawyer, Mead. I've seen his sign on in street. Paulding wants me to play the prodigal nephew. Wants me to come back and be his heir again and blow in his money. I'm to call at the lawyer's office at 10 tomorrow and step into my old shoes again, heir to $3 million, Dawson, and $10,000 a year pocket money. And I'm afraid. The vagrant leaped to his feet and raised both trembling arms above his bead. He caught his breath and moaned hysterically. Valance seized his arm and forced him back to the bench. Be quiet, he commanded, with something like disgust in his tones. One would think you had lost a fortune instead of being about to acquire one. Of what are you afraid? I'd cowered and shivered on the bench. He clung to Valance's sleeve, and even in the dim glow of the Broadway lights, the latest disinherited, one could see drops on the other's brow wrung out by some strange terror. Why? I'm afraid something will happen to me before morning. I don't know what, something to keep me from coming into that money. I'm afraid a tree will fall on me. I'm afraid a cab will run over me, or a stone drop on me from a house stop or something. I never was afraid before. I've sat in this park 100 nights as calm as a graven image without knowing where my breakfast was to come from. But now it's different. I love money, son. I'm happy as a god when it's trickling through my fingers and people are bowing to me, with the music and the flowers and fine clothes all around. As long as I knew I was out of the game, I didn't mind. I was even happy sitting here ragged and hungry, listening to the fountain jump and watching the carriages go up the avenue. But it's in reach of my hand again now, almost, and I can't stand it to wait 12 hours, Dawson. I can't stand it. There are 50 things that could happen to me. I could go blind. I might be attacked with heart disease. The world might come to an end before I could. Ide sprang to his feet again, with a shriek. Ple stirred on the benches and began to look. Lance took his arm. Come and walk, he said, soothingly, and try to calm yourself. There is no need to become excited or alarmed. Nothing is going to happen to you. One night is like another. That's right, said Ide. Stay with me, Dawson. That's a good fellow. Walk around with me a while. I never went to pieces like this before, and I've had a good many hard knocks. Do you think you could hustle something in the way of a little lunch, old man? I'm afraid my nerve's too far gone to try any panhandling. Valance led his companion up almost deserted Fifth Avenue, and then westward along the 30s toward Broadway. Wait here a few minutes, he said, leaving Ide in a quiet and shadowed spot. He entered a familiar hotel and strolled toward the bar quite in his old assured way. There's a poor devil outside, Jimmy, he said to the bartender, who says he's hungry and looks it. You know what they do when you give them money. Fix up a sandwich or two for him, and I'll see that he doesn't throw it away. Certainly, Mr. Valance, said the bartender. They ain't all fakes. Don't like to see anybody go hungry. I'd folded a liberal supply of the free lunch into a napkin. Valance went with it and joined his companion. I'd pounced upon the food ravenously. I haven't had any free lunch as good as this in a year, he said. Aren't you going to eat any, Dawson? I'm not hungry, thanks, said Valance. We'll go back to the square, said Ide. The cops won't bother us there. I'll roll up the rest of this ham and stuff for our breakfast. I won't eat any more. I'm afraid I'll get sick. Suppose I die of cramps or something tonight and never get to touch that money again. It's 11 hours yet till time to see that lawyer. You won't leave me, will you, Dawson? I'm afraid something might happen. You haven't any place to go, have you? No, said Valance. Nowhere tonight. I'll have a bench with you. You take it cool, said Ide. If you've told it to me straight. I should think a man put on the bum from a good job just in one day would be tearing his hair. I believe I've already remarked, said Valance, laughing, that I would have thought that a man who was expecting to come into a fortune on the next day would be feeling pretty easy and quiet. It's funny business, philosophized Ide, about the way people take things. Anyhow, here's your bench, Dawson, right next to mine. The light don't shine in your eyes here. Say, Dawson, I'll get the old man to give you a letter to somebody about a job when I get back home. You've helped me a lot tonight. I don't believe I could have gone through the night if I hadn't struck you. Thank you, said Valance. Do you lie down or sit up on these when you sleep? For hours Valance gazed almost without winking at the stars through the branches of the trees and listened to the sharp slapping of horses' hoofs on the sea of asphalt. To the south his mind was active, but his feelings were dormant. Every emotion seemed to have been eradicated. I'd felt no regrets, no fears, no pain or discomfort. Even when bethought of the girl, it was as of an inhabitant of one of those remote stars at which be gazed. He remembered the absurd antics of his companion and laughed softly, yet without a feeling of mirth. Soon the daily army of milk wagons made of the city a roaring drum to which they marched. Valance fell asleep on his comfortless bench. At 10 o'clock on the next day, the two stood at the door of Lawyer Mead's office in N Street. Ide's nerves fluttered worse than ever when the hour approached, and Valance could not decide to leave him a possible prey to the dangers he dreaded. When they entered the office, Lawyer Mead looked at them wonderingly. He and Valance were old friends. After his greeting, he turned to Ide, who stood with white face and trembling limbs before the expected crisis. I sent a second letter to your address last night, Mr. Ide, he said. I learned this morning that you were not there to receive it. It will inform you that Mr. Paulding has reconsidered his offer to take you back into favor. He has decided not to do so, and desires you to understand that no change will be made in the relations existing between you and him. Ide's trembling suddenly ceased. The color came back to his face, and straightened his back. His jaw went forward half an inch, and a gleam came into his eye. He pushed back his battered bat with one hand, and extended the other, with leveled fin, jeers, toward the lawyer. He took a long breath, and then laughed sardonically. Tell old Paulding he may go to the devil, he said, loudly and clearly, and turned and walked out of the office with a firm and lively step. Lawyer Mead turned on his heel to Valance and smiled. I am glad you came in, he said genially. Your uncle wants you to return home at once. He is reconciled to the situation that led to his hasty action, and desires to say that all will be as. Hey, Adams, cried Lawyer Mead, breaking his sentence and calling to his clerk. Bring a glass of water, Mr. Valance has fainted. The Shamrock and the Palm, by O. Henry. One night when there was no breeze, and Coralio seemed closer than ever to the gratings of Avernus, 5 men were grouped about the door of the photograph establishment of Keogh and Clancy. Thus, in all the scorched and exotic places of the earth, Caucasians meet when the day's work is done to preserve the fullness of their heritage by the aspersion of alien things. Johnny Atwood lay stretched upon the grass in the undress uniform of a Carib, and prated feebly of cool water to be had in the Cucumber Wood pumps of Dalesburg. Dr. Gregg, through the prestige of his whiskers and as a bribe against the relation of his eminent professional tales, was conceded the hammock that was swung between the door jamb and a calabash tree. Keogh had moved out upon the grass a little table that held the instrument for burnishing completed photographs. He was the only busy one of the group. Industriously from between the cylinders of the burnisher rolled the finished depictments of Coralio's citizens. Blanchard, the French mining engineer, in his cool linen viewed the smoke of his cigarette through his calm glasses, impervious to the heat. Clancy sat on the steps, smoking his short pipe. His mood was the gossip's. The others were reduced, by the humidity, to the state of disability desirable in an audience. Clancy was an American with an Irish diathesis and cosmopolitan proclivities. Many businesses had claimed him, but not for long. The roadster's blood was in his veins. The voice of the tintype was but one of the many callings that had wooed him upon so many roads. Sometimes he could be persuaded to oral construction of his voyages into the informal and egregious. Tonight there were symptoms of divulgement in him. "'Tis elegant weather for filibustering," he volunteered. "It reminds me of the time I struggled to liberate a nation from the poisonous breath of a tyrant's clutch. 'Twas hard work. 'Tis straining to the back and makes corns on the hands." "I didn't know you had ever lent your sword to an oppressed people," murmured Atwood from the grass. "I did," said Clancy, "and they turned it into a plowshare." "What country was so fortunate as to secure your aid?" airily inquired Blanchard. "Where's Kamchatka?" asked Clancy with seeming irrelevance. "Why, off Siberia somewhere in the Arctic regions," somebody answered, doubtfully. "I thought that was the cold one," said Clancy with a satisfied nod. "I'm always gettin' the two names mixed. 'Twas Guatemala, then the hot one I've been filibusterin' with. You'll find that country on the map. 'Tis in the district known as the tropics. By the foresight of Providence, it lies on the coast, so the geography men could run the names of the towns off into the water. They're an inch long, small type, composed of Spanish dialects and, 'tis my opinion, of the same system of syntax that blew up the Maine. Yes, 'twas that country I sailed against, single-handed, and endeavored to liberate it from a tyrannical government with a single-barreled pickaxe, unloaded at that. You don't understand, of course. 'Tis a statement demanding elucidation and apologies. 'Twas in New Orleans one morning about the 1st of June. I was standing down on the wharf, looking about at the ships in the river. There was a little steamer moored right opposite me that seemed about ready to sail. The funnels of it were throwing out smoke, and a gang of roustabouts were carrying aboard a pile of boxes that was stacked up on the wharf. The boxes were about 2 feet square and something like 4 feet long, and they seemed to be pretty heavy. I walked over, careless, to the stack of boxes. I saw one of them had been broken in handling. 'Twas curiosity made me pull up the loose top and look inside. The box was packed full of Winchester rifles. So, says I to myself, somebody's getting a twist on the neutrality laws. Somebody's aidin' with munitions of war. I wonder where the pop guns are going. I heard somebody cough, and I turned around. There stood a little, round, fat man with a brown face and white clothes, a first-class, looking little man, with a 4-carat diamond on his finger and his eye full of interrogations and respects. I judged he was a kind of foreigner, maybe from Russia or Japan or the archipelagos. "Hist," says the round man, full of concealments and confidences. "Will the senor respect the discoveryments he has made, that the mans on the ship shall not be acquaint? The senor will be a gentleman that shall not expose one thing that by accident occur." "Monsieur," says I, for I judged him to be a kind of Frenchman, "receive my most exasperated assurances that your secret is safe with James Clancy. Furthermore, I will go so far as to remark, vive la liberty, vive it good and strong. Whenever you hear of a Clancy obstructing the abolishment of existing governments, you may notify me by return mail." "The senor is good," says the dark, fat man, smiling under his black mustache. "Wish you to come aboard my ship and drink of wine a glass." Being a Clancy, in 2 minutes me and the foreigner man were seated at a table in the cabin of the steamer, with a bottle between us. I could hear the heavy boxes being dumped into the hold. I judged that cargo must consist of at least 2,000 Winchesters. Me and the brown man drank the bottle of stuff, and he called the steward to bring another. When you amalgamate a Clancy with the contents of a bottle, you practically instigate secession. I had heard a good deal about these revolutions in them tropical localities, and I begun to want a hand in it. "You going to stir things up in your country, ain't you, monsieur?" says I, with a wink to let him know I was on. Yes, said the little man, pounding his fist on the table. "A change of the greatest will occur. Too long have the people been oppressed with the promises and the never-to-happen things to become. The great work it shall be carry on. Yes, our forces shall in the capital city strike of the soonest. Carambos! Carambos is the word, says I, beginning to invest myself with enthusiasm and more wine. Likewise viva, as I said before. May the shamrock of old, I mean the banana vine or the pie plant, or whatever the imperial emblem may be of your downtrodden country, wave forever. 1,000 thank yous, says the round man, for your emission of amicable utterances. What our cause needs of the very most is man's who will the work do, to lift it along. Oh, for 1,000 strong, good mans to aid the General de Vega, that he shall to his country bring those success and glory. It is hard, oh, so hard to find good mans to help in the work. Monsieur, says I, lean in over the table and grop in his hand. I don't know where your country is, but me heart bleeds for it. The heart of a Clancy was never deaf to the sight of an oppressed people. The family is filibusters by birth and foreigners by trade. If you can use James Clancy's arms and his blood in denuding your shores of the tyrant's yoke, they're yours to command. General de Vega was overcome with joy to confiscate my condolence of his conspiracies and predicaments. He tried to embrace me across the table, but his fatness, and the wine that had been in the bottles, prevented. Thus was I welcomed into the ranks of filibustery. Then the general man told me his country had the name of Guatemala, and was the greatest nation laved by any ocean whatever anywhere. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and from time to time he would emit the remark, "Ah, big, strong, brave mans, that is what my country need." General de Vega, as was the name by which he denounced himself, brought out a document for me to sign, which I did, making a fine flourish and curlicue with the tail of the Y. Your passage money, says the general businesslike, shall from your pay be deduct. 'Twill not, says I haughty. I'll pay my own passage. $180 I had in my inside pocket, and 'twas no common filibuster I was going to be, filibusterin', for me board and clothes. The steamer was to sail in 2 hours, and I went ashore to get some things together I'd need. When I came aboard, I showed the general with pride the outfit. 'Twas a fine chinchilla overcoat, Arctic overshoes, fur cap and earmuffs, with elegant fleece-lined gloves and woolen muffler. Carambos, says the little general, what clothes are these that shall go to the tropic? And then the little spalpeen laughs, and he calls the captain, and the captain calls the purser, and they pipe up the chief engineer, and the whole gang leans against the cabin and laughs at Clancy's wardrobe for Guatemala. I reflects a bit, serious, and asks the general again to denominate the terms by which his country is called. He tells me, and I see then that 'twas the t'other one, Kamchatka, I had in mind. Since then I've had difficulty in separating the two nations in name, climate, and geographic disposition. I paid my passage $24, first cabin and ate at table with the officer crowd. Down on the lower deck was a gang of second-class passengers, about 40 of them, seamen to be Dagos and the like. I wondered what so many of them were going along for. Well, then, in 3 days we sailed alongside that Guatemala. 'Twas a blue country, and not yellow as 'tis mis-colored on the map. We landed at a town on the coast, where a train of cars was waitin' for us on a dinky little railroad. The boxes on the steamer were brought ashore and loaded on the cars. The gang of Dagos got aboard, too, the general and me in the front car. Yes, me and General de Vega headed the revolution as it pulled out of the seaport town. That train traveled about as fast as a policeman going to a riot. It penetrated the most conspicuous lot of fuzzy scenery ever seen outside of geography. We run some 40 miles in 7 hours, and the train stopped. There was no more railroad. 'Twas a sort of camp in a damp gorge full of wildness and melancholies. They was grading and chopping out the forests ahead to continue the road. Here, says I to myself, is the romantic haunt of the revolutionists. Here will Clancy, by the virtue that is in a superior race and the inculcation of Fenian tactics, strike a tremendous blow for liberty. They unloaded the boxes from the train and begun to knock the tops off. From the first one that was open I saw General de Vega take the Winchester rifles and pass them around to a squad of morbid soldiery. The other boxes was open next, and believe me or not, divil another gun was to be seen. Every other box in the load was full of pickaxes and spades. And then sorrow be upon them tropics, the proud Clancy and the dishonored Dagos, each one of them, had to shoulder a pick or a spade and march away to work on that dirty little railroad. Yes, 'twas that the Dagos shipped for, and 'twas that the filibusterin' Clancy signed for, though unbeknownst to himself at the time. In after days I found out about it. It seems 'twas hard to get hands to work on that road. The intelligent natives of the country was too lazy to work. Indeed, the saints know 'twas unnecessary. By stretchin' out one hand, they could seize the most delicate and costly fruits of the earth, and by stretchin' out the other, they could sleep for days at a time without hearin' a 7 o'clock whistle or the footsteps of the rent man upon the stairs. So, regular, the steamers traveled to the United States to seduce labor. Usually the imported spade slingers died in 2 or 3 months from eating the overripe water and breathing the violent tropical scenery. Wherefore they made them sign contracts for a year, when they hired them, and put an armed guard over the poor devils to keep them from running away. 'Twas thus I was double-crossed by the tropics through a family failing of going out of the way to hunt disturbances. They gave me a pick and I took it, meditating an insurrection on the spot, but there was the guards handling the Winchesters careless, and I come to the conclusion that discretion was the best part of filibustering. There was about 100 of us in the gang starting out to work, and the word was given to move. I steps out of the ranks and goes up to that General de Vega man, who was smoking a cigar and gazing upon the scene with satisfactions and glory. He smiles at me polite and devilish. "Plenty work," says he, "for big, strong mans in Guatemala. Yes, $30 in the month. Good pay. Ah, yes. You strong, brave man. Bimeby we push those railroad in the capital very quick. They want you go work now. Adios, strong mans." "Monsieur," says I, Ling Aaron, "will you tell a poor little Irishman this? When I set foot on your cockroachy steamer and breathed liberal and revolutionary sentiments into your sour wine, did you think I was conspiring to sling a pick on your contemptuous little railroad? And when you answered me with patriotic recitations, pumping up the star-spangled cause of liberty, did you have meditations of reducing me to the ranks of the stump-grubbing Dagos and the chain gangs of your vile and groveling country?" The general man expanded his rotundity and laughed considerable. Yes, he laughed very long and loud, and I, Clancy, stood and waited. "Comical mans," he shouts at last. "So you will kill me from the laughing. Yes, it is hard to find the brave, strong mans to aid my country. Revolutions? Did I speak of our revolutions? Not one word. I say, big, strong man is need in Guatemala. So, the mistake is of you. You have looked in those one box containing those gun for the guard. You think all boxes is contain gun? No, there is not war in Guatemala. But work? Yes, good. $30 in the month. You shall shoulder one pickaxe, senor, and dig for the liberty and prosperity of Guatemala. Off to your work. The guard waits for you." "Little, fat, poodle dog of a brown man," says I, quiet, but full of indignations and discomforts, "things shall happen to you. Maybe not right away, but as soon as J. Clancy can formulate something in the way of repartee. The boss of the gang orders us to work. I tramps off with the Dagos, and I hears the distinguished patriot and kidnapper Logan hearty as we go. 'Tis a sorrowful fact. For 8 weeks I built railroads for that misbehavin' country. I filibustered 12 hours a day with a heavy pick and a spade, chopping away the luxurious landscape that grew upon the right-of-way. We worked in swamps that smelled like there was a leak in the gas mains, tramping down a fine assortment of the most expensive hothouse plants and vegetables. The scene was tropical beyond the wildest imagination of the geography man. The trees was all skyscrapers. The underbrush was full of needles and pins. There was monkeys jumping around and crocodiles and pink-tailed mockingbirds, and ye stood knee-deep in the rotten water and grab-led roots for the liberation of Guatemala. Of nights we would build smudges and camp to discourage the mosquitoes and sit in the smoke, with the guards passing all around us. There was 200 men working on the road, mostly Dagos, nigger men, Spanish men, and Swedes. 3 or 4 were Irish. One old man named Halloran, a man of Hibernian entitlements and discretions, explained it to me. He had been working on the road a year. Most of them died in less than 6 months. He was dried up to gristle and bone, and shook with chills every third night. When you first come, says he, ye think you'll leave right away. But they hold out your first month's pay for your passage over, and by that time the tropics has its grip on ye. Ye're surrounded by a ragin' forest full of disreputable beasts, lions and baboons and anacondas, waiting to devour ye. The sun strikes ye hard, and melts the marrow in your bones. Ye get similar to the lettuce eaters the poetry book speaks about. Ye forget the elevated sentiments of life, such as patriotism, revenge, disturbances of the peace, and the dascent love of a clean shirt. Ye do your work, and ye swallow the kerosene aisle and rubber pipe stems dished up to ye by the dago cook for food. Ye light your pipe full and say to yourself, next week I'll break away. And ye go to sleep and call yourself a liar, for ye know ye'll never do it. Who is this general man, asks I, that calls himself de Vega? 'Tis the man, says Halloran, who is trying to complete the finishin' of the railroad. 'Twas the project of a private corporation, but it busted, and then the government took it up. De Veggie is a big politician and wants to be president. The people want the railroad completed, as they're taxed mighty on account of it. The De Veggie man is pushing it along as a campaign move. 'Tis not my way, says I, to make threats against any man, but there's an account to be settled between the railroad man and James O'Dowd Clancy. 'Twas that way I thought, Mazilf, at first, Halloran says with a big sigh, until I got to be a lettuce eater. The faults with these tropics. They reduces a man's system. 'Tis a land, as the poet says, where it always seems to be after dinner. I does me work and smokes me pipe and sleeps. There's little else in life, anyway. You'll get that way yourself, mighty soon. Don't be harborin' any sentiments at all, Clancy. I can't help it, says I. I'm full of 'em. I enlisted in the Revolutionary Army of this dark country in good faith to fight for its liberty, honors, and silver candlesticks, instead of which I am set to amputatin' its scenery and grubbin' its roots. 'Tis the general man will have to pay for it. 2 months I worked on that railroad before I found a chance to get away. One day a gang of us was sent back to the end of the completed line to fetch some picks that had been sent down to Port Barrios to be sharpened. They were brought on a handcar, and I noticed, when I started away, that the car was left there on the track. That night, about 12, I woke up Halloran and told him my scheme. Run away, says Halloran. Good Lord, Clancy, do ye mean it? Why, I ain't got the nerve. It's too chilly, and I ain't slept enough. Run away? I told you, Clancy, I've eat the lettuce. I've lost my grip. 'Tis the tropics that's done it. 'Tis like the poet says, forgotten are our friends that we have left behind. In the hollow lettuce land we will live and lay reclined. You better go on, Clancy. I'll stay, I guess. It's too early and cold, and I'm sleepy. So I had to leave Halloran. I dressed quiet and slipped out of the tent we were in. When the guard came along, I knocked him over, like a 9-pin, with a green coconut I had, and made for the railroad. I got on that handcar and made it fly. 'Twas yet a while before daybreak when I saw the lights of Port Barrios about a mile away. I stopped the handcar there and walked to the town. I stepped inside the corporations of that town with care and hesitations. I was not afraid of the army of Guatemala, but me soul quaked at the prospect of a hand-to-hand struggle with its employment bureau. 'Tis a country that hires its help easy and keeps him long. Sure, I can fancy Mrs. America and Mrs. Guatemala passin', a bit of gossip some fine. Still night across the mountains. Oh dear, says Mrs. America, and it's a lot of trouble I'm having AG in with the help, Sonora, ma'am. Laws now, says Mrs. Guatemala, you don't say so, ma'am. Now, mine never think o' fleavin' me. Ma'am, snickers Mrs. Guatemala. I was wonderin' how I was goin' to move away from them tropics without bein' hired again. Dark as it was, I could see a steamer ridin' in the harbor, with smoke emergin' from her stacks. I turned down a little grass street that run down to the water. On the beach I found a little brown nigger man just about to shove off in a skiff. Hold on, Sambo, says I. Sav English? He plenty, yes, says he with a pleasant grin. What steamer is that? I asks him. And where is it going? And what's the news, and the good word, and the time of day? That steamer the Conchita, said the brown man, affable and easy, rollin' a cigarette. Him come from New Orleans for load banana. Him got load last night. I think him sailin' 1-2 hour. Very nice day we shall be goin' have. You hear some talky, 'bout big battle. Maybe so? You think catchy General de Vega, senor? Yes? No? How's that, Sambo? Says I. Big battle? What battle? Who wants catchy General de Vega? I've been up at my old gold mines in the interior for a couple of months and haven't heard any news. Oh, says the nigger man, proud to speak the English. Very great revolution in Guatemala 1 week ago. General de Vega, him try be president. Him raise army 1-5-10,000 mans for fight at the government. Those one government send 5-40,000 soldier to suppress revolution. They fight big battle yesterday at Lomagran that about 19 or 50 mile in the mountain. That government soldier weep General de Vega, most bad. 500-902,000 of his mans is kill. That revolution is smash suppress bust very quick. General de Vega, him are run away fast on one big mule. Yes, carambos. The general, him are run away, and his army is kill. That government soldier, they try find General de Vega very much. They want catchy him for shoot. You think they catchy that general, senor? Saints grant it, says I. 'Twould be the judgment of Providence for set in the warlike talent of a Clancy to graden the tropics with a pick and shovel. But 'tis not so much a question of insurrections now, me little man, as 'tis of the hired man problem. 'Tis anxious I am to resign a situation of responsibility and trust with the White Wings Department of your great and degraded country. Row me in your little boat out to that steamer, and I'll give ye $5 sinker pacers, says I, reducing the offer to the language and denomination of the tropic dialects. Cinco pesos, repeats the little man. $5, you give? 'Twas not such a bad little man. He had hesitations at first, sayin' that passengers leavin' the country had to have papers and passports, but at last he took me out alongside the steamer. Day was just breakin' as we struck her, and there wasn't a soul to be seen on board. The water was very still, and the nigger man gave me a lift from the boat, and I climbed onto the steamer where her side was sliced to the deck for loadin' fruit. The hatches was open, and I looked down and saw the cargo of bananas that filled the hold to within 6 feet of the top. I thinks to myself, Clancy, you better go as a stowaway. It's safer. The steamermen might hand you back to the Employment Bureau. The tropic'll get you, Clancy, if you don't watch out. So I jumps down easy among the bananas and digs out a hole to hide in among the bunches. In an hour or so I could hear the engines going and feel the steamer rockin', and I knew we were off to sea. They left the hatches open for ventilation, and pretty soon it was light enough in the hold to see fairly well. I got to feelin' a bit hungry and thought I'd have a light fruit lunch by way of refreshment. I creeped out of the hole I'd made and stood up straight. Just then I saw another man crawl up about 10 feet away and reach out and skin a banana and stuff it into his mouth. 'Twas a dirty man, black-faced and ragged and disgraceful of aspect. Yes, the man was a ringer for the pictures of the fat Weary Willie in the funny papers. I looked again and saw it was my General Man de Vega, the great revolutionist, mule rider, and pickaxe importer. When he saw me, the general hesitated with his mouth filled with banana and his eyes the size of coconuts. Hist, I says. Not a word, or they'll put us off and make us walk. Vive la liberty, I adds, comparing the sentiment by shoving a banana into the source of it. I was certain the general wouldn't recognize me. The nefarious work of the tropics had left me looking different. There was half an inch of roan whiskers covering me face, and me costume was a pair of blue overalls and a red shirt. How you come in the ship, senor? Asked the general as soon as he could speak. By the back door whist, says I. 'Twas a glorious blow for liberty we struck, I continues, but we was overpowered by numbers. Let us accept our defeat like brave men and eat another banana. Were you in the cause of liberty fightin', senor? Says the general, shedding tears on the cargo. To the last, says I. 'Twas I led the last desperate charge against the minions of the tyrant. But it made them mad, and we was forced to retreat. 'Twas I, General, procured the mule upon which you escaped. Could you give that ripe bunch a little boost this way, General? It's a bit out of my reach. Thanks. Say you so, brave patriot? Said the General, again weeping. Ah, Dios! And I have not the means to reward your devotion. Barely did I my life bring away. Carambos! What a devil's animal was that mule, senor. Like ships in one storm was I dashed about. The skin on myself was ripped away with the thorns and vines. Upon the bark of 100 trees did that beast of the infernal bump, and cause outrage to the legs of mine. In the night to Port Barrios I came. I dispossess myself of that mountain of mule, and hasten along the water shore. I find a little boat to be tied. I launch myself and row to the steamer. I cannot see any man's on board, so I climbed one rope which hang at the side. I then myself hide in the bananas. Surely, I say, if the ship captains view me, they shall throw me again to those Guatemala. Those things are not good. Guatemala will shoot General de Vega. Therefore, I am hide and remain silent. Life itself is glorious. Liberty, it is pretty good, but so good as life I do not think. 3 days, as I said, was the trip to New Orleans. The general man and me got to be cronies of the deepest dye. Bananas we ate until they were distasteful to the sight and an eyesore to the palate, but to bananas alone was the bill of fare reduced. At night I crawls out, careful, on the lower deck, and gets a bucketful of fresh water. That General de Vega was a man inhabited by an engorgement of words and sentences. He added to the monotony of the voyage by divestin himself of conversation. He believed I was a revolutionist of his own party, there being, as he told me, a good many Americans and other foreigners in its ranks. 'Twas a braggart and a conceited little gabbler it was, though he considered himself a hero. 'Twas on himself he wasted all his regrets at the failing of his plot. Not a word did the little balloon have to say about the other misbehaving idiots that had been shot, or run themselves to death in his revolution. The second day out he was feeling pretty braggy and uppish for a stowed-away conspirator that owed his existence to a mule and stolen bananas. He was telling me about the great railroad he had been building, and he relates what he calls a comic incident about a fool Irishman he inveigled from New Orleans to sling a pick on his little morgue of a narrow-gauge line. 'Twas sorrowful to hear the little, dirty general tell the opprobrious story of how he put salt upon the tail of that reckless and silly bird, Clancy. Laugh, he did, hearty and long. He shook with Logan, the black-faced rebel and outcast, standing neck-deep in bananas, without friends or country. Ah, senor, he snickers. To death you would have laughed at that drollest Irish. I say to him, strong, big mans is need very much in Guatemala. I will blows strike for your down-pressed country, he say. That shall you do, I tell him. Ah, it was an Irish so comic. He sees one box break upon the wharf that contained for the guard a few gun. He think there is gun in all the box. But that is all pickaxe. Yes. Ah, senor, could you the face of that Irish have seen when they set him to the work? 'Twas thus the ex-boss of the Employment Bureau contributed to the tedium of the trip with merry jests and anecdote. But now and then he would weep upon the bananas and make oration about the lost cause of liberty and the mule. 'Twas a pleasant sound when the steamer bumped against the pier in New Orleans. Pretty soon we heard the pat-a-pat of hundreds of bare feet, and the Dago gang that unloads the fruit jumped on the deck and down into the hold. Me and the general worked a while at passing up the bunches, and they thought we were part of the gang. After about an hour we managed to slip off the steamer onto the wharf. 'Twas a great honor on the hands of an obscure Clancy, having the entertainment of the representative of a great foreign filibustering power. I first bought for the general and myself many long drinks and things to eat that were not bananas. The general man trotted along at my side, leaving all the arrangements to me. I led him up to Lafayette Square and set him on a bench in the little park. Cigarettes I had bought for him, and he humped himself down on the seat like a little, fat, contented hobo. I look him over as he sits there, and what I see pleases me. Brown by nature and instinct, He is now brindled with dirt and dust. Praise to the mule, his clothes is mostly strings and flaps. Yes, the looks of the general man is agreeable to Clancy. I asks him delicate, if, by any chance, he brought away anybody's money with him from Guatemala. He sighs and humps his shoulders against the bench. Not a cent. All right. Maybe, he tells me, some of his friends in the tropic outfit will send him funds later. The general was as clear a case of no visible means as I ever saw. I told him not to move from the bench, and then I went up to the corner of Poitras and Carondelet. Along there is O'Hara's beat. In 5 minutes along comes O'Hara, a big, fine man, red-faced, with shireen buttons, swinging his club. 'Twould be a fine thing for Guatemala to move into O'Hara's precinct. 'Twould be a fine bit of recreation for Danny to suppress revolutions and uprisings once or twice a week with his club. Is 5046 workin' yet, Danny? Says I, walking up to him. Over time, says O'Hara, looking over me suspicious. Want some of it? 5046 is the celebrated city ordinance authorizing arrest, conviction, and imprisonment of persons that succeed in concealing their crimes from the police. Don't you know Jimmy Clancy? Says I. Ye pink-gilled monster. So, when O'Hara recognized me beneath the scandalous exterior bestowed upon me by the tropics, I backed him into a doorway and told him what I wanted and why I wanted it. All right, Jimmy, says O'Hara. Go back and hold the bench. I'll be along in 10 minutes. In that time O'Hara strolled through Lafayette Square and spied 2 weary willies disgracing one of the benches. In 10 minutes more J. Clancy and General De Vega, late candidate for the presidency of Guatemala, was in the station house. The general is badly frightened and calls upon me to proclaim his distinguishments and rank. The man, says I to the police, used to be a railroad man. He's on the bum now. 'Tis a little bughouse he is, on account of losin' his job. Carambos, says the general, fizzin' like a little soda fountain. You fought, senor, with my forces in my native country. Why do you say the lies? You shall say I am the General De Vega, one soldier, one caballero. Railroader, says I again. On the hog. No good. Been livin' for 3 days on stolen bananas. Look at him. Ain't that enough? $25 or 60 days was what the recorder gave the general. He didn't have a cent, so he took the time. They let me go, as I knew they would, for I had money to show, and O'Hara spoke for me. Yes, 60 days he got. 'Twas just so long as I slung a pick for the great country of Guatemala. Clancy paused. The bright starlight showed a reminiscent look of happy content on his seasoned features. Keogh leaned in his chair and gave his partner a slap on his thinly clad back that sounded like the crack of the surf on the sands. Tell him, ye divil, he chuckled, how you got even with the tropical general in the way of agricultural maneuverings. Having no money, concluded Clancy with unction, they set him to work his fine out with a gang from the parish prison clearing Ursuline Street. Around the corner was a saloon decorated genially with electric fans and cool merchandise. I made that me headquarters, and every 15 minutes I'd walk around and take a look at the little man filibusterin' with a rake and shovel. 'Twas just such a hot broth of a day as this has been, and I'd call at him, "Hey, Monsieur," and he'd look at me black, with the damp showin' through his shirt in places. Fat, strong mans, says I to General De Vega, is needed in New Orleans. Yes, to carry on the good work. Carambos, Aaron go braff. The Rubber Plant Story, by O. Henry. We rubber plants form the connecting link between the vegetable kingdom and the decorations of a Waldorf Astoria scene in a 3rd Avenue theater. I haven't looked up our family tree, but I believe we were raised by grafting a gum overshoe onto a 30-cent table d'hote stalk of asparagus. You take a white bulldog with a Burke Cochran air of independence about him and a rubber plant, and there you have the fauna and flora of a flat. What the shamrock is to Ireland, the rubber plant is to the dweller in flats and furnished rooms. We get moved from one place to another so quickly that the only way we can get our picture taken is with a kinetoscope. We are the vagrant vine and the flitting fig tree. You know the proverb, where the rubber plant sits in the window, the moving van draws up to the door. We are the city equivalent to the woodbine and the honeysuckle. No other vegetable except the Pittsburgh stogie can withstand as much handling as we can. When the family to which we belong moves into a flat, they set us in the front window, and we become Laura's and Penates, flypaper, and the peripatetic emblem of home sweet home. We aren't as green as we look. I guess we are about what you would call the soubrettes of the conservatory. You try sitting in the front window of a $40 flat in Manhattan and looking out into the street all day and back into the flat at night, and see whether you get wise or not. Hey, talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, say. Suppose there had been a rubber plant there when Eve, but I was going to tell you a story. The first thing I can remember, I had only 3 leaves and belonged to a member of the pony ballet. I was kept in a sunny window and was generally watered with seltzer and lemon. I had plenty of fun in those days. I got cross-eyed trying to watch the numbers of the automobiles in the street and the dates on the labels inside at the same time. Well, then the angel that was molting for the musical comedy lost his last feather and the company broke up. The ponies trotted away and I was left in the window ownerless. The janitor gave me to a refined comedy team on the 8th floor, and in 6 weeks I had been set in the window of 5 different flats. I took on experience and put out 2 more leaves. Miss Carruthers, of the refined comedy team, did you ever see her cross both feet back of her neck? Gave me to a friend of hers who had made an unfortunate marriage with a man in a store. Consequently, I was placed in the window of a furnished room. Rent in advance, water 2 flights up, gas extra after 10 o'clock at night. 2 of my leaves withered off here. Also, I was moved from one room to another so many times that I got to liking the odor of the pipes the expressmen smoked. I don't think I ever had so dull a time as I did with this lady. There was never anything amusing going on inside. She was devoted to her husband, and, besides leaning out the window and flirting with the iceman, she never did a thing toward breaking the monotony. When the couple broke up, they left me with the rest of their goods at a second-hand store. I was put out in front for sale, along with the jobbiest lot you ever heard of being lumped into one bargain. Think of this little cornucopia of wonders, all for $1.89. Henry James's works, 6 talking machine records, 1 pair of tennis shoes, 2 bottles of horseradish, and a rubber plant. That was me. One afternoon a girl came along and stopped to look at me. She had dark hair and eyes, and she looked slim and sat around the mouth. Oh, she says to herself, I never thought to see one up here. She pulls out a little purse about as thick as one of my leaves and fingers over some small silver in it. Old Coon, always on the lookout, is ready, rubbing his hands. This girl proceeds to turn down Mr. James and the other commodities. Rubber plants or nothing is the burden of her song. And at last Coon and she come together at 39 cents, and away she goes with me in her arms. She was a nice girl, but not my style. Too quiet and sober-looking. Thinks I to myself, I'll just about land on the fire escape of a tenement, 6 stories up, and I'll spend the next 6 months looking at clothes on the line. But she carried me to a nice little room only 3 flights up in quite a decent street. And she put me in the window, of course. And then she went to work and cooked dinner for herself. And what do you suppose she had? Bread and tea and a little dab of jam. Nothing else. Not a single lobster, nor so much as 1 bottle of champagne. The Carruthers comedy team had both every evening, except now and then when they took a notion for pig's knuckle and kraut. After she had finished her dinner, my new owner came to the window and leaned down close to my leaves and cried softly to herself for a while. It made me feel funny. I never knew anybody to cry that way over a rubber plant before. Of course, I've seen a few of them turn on the tears for what they could get out of it, but she seemed to be crying just for the pure enjoyment of it. She touched my leaves like she loved him, and she bent down her head and kissed each one of him. I guess I'm about the toughest specimen of a peripatetic orchid on earth, but I tell you it made me feel sort of queer. Home never was like that to me before. Generally, I used to get chewed by poodles and have shirtwaists hung on me to dry, and get watered with coffee grounds and peroxide of hydrogen. This girl had a piano in the room, and she used to disturb it with both hands while she made noises with her mouth for hours at a time. I suppose she was practicing vocal music. One day, she seemed very much excited and kept looking at the clock. At 11, somebody knocked and she let in a stout, dark man with toast-lead black hair. He sat down at once at the piano and played while she sang for him. When she finished, she laid one hand on her bosom and looked at him. He shook his head, and she leaned against the piano. 2 years already, she said, speaking slowly. Do you think in 2 more or even longer? The man shook his head again. You waste your time, he said, roughly I thought. The voice is not there. And then he looked at her in a peculiar way. But the voice is not everything, he went on. You have looks. I can place you, as I told you if... The girl pointed to the door without saying anything, and the dark man left the room. And then she came over and cried around me again. It's a good thing I had enough rubber in me to be waterproof. About that time, somebody else knocked at the door. Thank goodness, I said to myself. Here's a chance to get the waterworks turned off. I hope it's somebody that's game enough to stand a bird and a bottle to liven things up a little. Tell you the truth, this little girl made me tired. A rubber plant likes to see a little sport now and then. I don't suppose there's another green thing in New York that sees as much of gay life unless it's the chartreuse or the sprigs of parsley around the dish. When the girl opens the door and steps a young chap in a traveling cap and picks her up in his arms, and she sings out, "Oh, Dick," and stays there long enough to, well, you've been a rubber plant too, sometimes, I suppose. Good thing, says I to myself. This is livelier than scales and weeping. Now there'll be something doing. You've got to go back with me, says the young man. I've come 2,000 miles for you. Aren't you tired of it yet, Bess? You've kept all of us waiting so long. Haven't you found out yet what is best? The bubble burst only today, says the girl. Come here, Dick, and see what I found the other day on the sidewalk for sale. She brings him by the hand and exhibits yours truly. How one ever got away up here, who can tell? I bought it with almost the last money I had. He looked at me, but he couldn't keep his eyes off her for more than a second. Do you remember the night, Bess, he said, when we stood under one of those on the bank of the bayou, and what you told me then? Gooalickins, I said to myself. Both of them stand under a rubber plant. Seems to me they are stretching matters somewhat. Do I not? Says she, looking up at him and sneaking close to his vest. And now I say it again, and it is to last forever. Look, Dick, at its leaves, how wet they are. Those are my tears, and it was thinking of you that made them fall. The dear old magnolias, says the young man, pinching one of my leaves. I love them all. Magnolia. Well, wouldn't that say? Those innocents thought I was a magnolia. What the well? Wasn't that tough on a genuine little old New York rubber plant?